Hi everyone and welcome to this week's extra webinar. This week we are joined by Heather, who's going to be talking about conflict resolution. If you do have any questions, just pop them in the question box and I'll get them to Heather. I'm just going to get started. I'll pass on to Heather now. Thank you everyone.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Well, today we're going to talk about conflict resolution, and my question to you is this: has anyone in this audience ever had a conflict with another person? I thought so. Everyone has a conflict, and here's a simple definition. When there are two or more people that come together, there's always a possibility of a conflict. So what we're going to talk about this is give you some steps and processes that you can use to modify, to resolve any size conflict. You will also learn crucial conflict resolution skills, including dealing with anger and using the agreement frame. Sounds good? Okay, let's get started. Our objectives today are simple: to understand what conflict and conflict resolution means, to understand all the phrases of conflict resolution. One moment. There we go. To understand the 5 main styles of conflict resolution, be able to adapt the process for all types of conflict, and be able to break out parts of the process and use those tools that prevent conflict, be able to use basic communication skills, and be able to use anger and stress management techniques. So let's do a little pre-assignment. Take a moment and look at the following statements. And if they're true, just raise your right hand. If they're false, raise your left hand. Conflict is always negative. True or false? Conflict is always violent. Conflict is inevitable. Ooh, can't say that word today. And anyone can experience conflict. Let's get an introduction to conflict resolution. People always assume that it's negative, but that's not true. It's inherently different and simple, and conflict simply means that those differences come to light, right? You've had a conflict maybe with your partner, your spouse, or even your workplace teammate. And those resolution can help explore and understand those differences and use them to interact in a more productive and positive way. Because isn't that what always happens at the end of a conflict? You end up being more positive than you were at the beginning of the process. So what is conflict? Now, I use Random Dictionary to define conflict as to come to a collision or a disagreement by contradictory at variance in opposition, to clash. For example, two sales representatives are arguing over who gets the largest customer. Has that ever happened to you? Maybe a team of employees upset with their manager over recent scheduling change. I know that has happened to me. Has it happened to you? Or a group of managers cannot decide who gets the latest project assignment. So these are a couple of types of conflict that are examples that show that you may have experienced in your work career and that we're going to talk about today. So again, what is conflict? It simply means how you solve conflicts. And here's some methods that you can use: mediation, a mediator, a dispute, an apparent conflict, or a hidden conflict. So let's understand the resolution process. You want to create an effective atmosphere. And this whenever I work with someone on who's involved in a conflict, the first thing I want to get them to or influence them to see is to neutralize their emotion, because once your emotion takes over, you're not going to really resolve the conflict in the best interest to you. So if you neutralize that and park that on the side, you have a better opportunity to resolve that. You always want to set ground rules and a time and a place in which to resolve or to engage in resolution of the conflict. You create mutual understandings. Me, to, me, them, and us. And you focus on individual and shared needs. You find common goals, right? You build positive energy and goodwill, and you always strengthen the partnership. But one of the most important factors in resolving conflict is getting to the root cause. And sometimes the root cause is hidden, and we go into the communication conflict and we believe that point A is the problem. However, it really, when we peel back the onion, we find that that's not really the problem. So we have to look at it differently and get to the core of why that conflict arose in the first place, right? You generate some good options and you build a solution. And that's really the best process that one can utilize to resolve conflict in a way that's mutually beneficial to all parties. Okay, let's look at some styles. These are 5 widely accepted styles of resolving conflict. The first one, collaboration. And this is when it's appropriate. It's not urgent. It's important decisions need to be made, and conflict involves a large number of people across different teams. Have you experienced that in your work situation? It's not appropriate to use this style when a decision is urgently at hand. If it needs to be made in an instance, you can't collaborate. Someone has to take the lead and make that decision. How about a competing style for the resolving the conflict? You know, maybe an unpopular decision that needs to be made and someone trying to take advantage of the situation. Has that ever happened to any of you in your work life situation? Okay. So this style is not appropriate to use when people are feeling sensitive about the conflict. And again, this is not urgent. How about creating a compromise? Always good when a decision needs to be made sooner rather than later, meaning it's important but not urgent. And resolving this conflict is more important than having an individual win. So it's not a win-win situation, but it's important to have that. And you create power between people is equal. Now, this style is not appropriate to use when important needs to be met, the situation is urgent, or when one person holds power over another. That's not a compromise. That's a us or them approach. And or as I would say, if I drew a heart around the situation, I never want an O or an O and an R to be in the middle. I rather have it be an and, because when I have the and in the middle, it's inclusive rather than a separator with the or. How about to accommodate? You know, we're getting, and if I'm moving too fast, please let me know, because we have a lot of ground to cover in this. But when you accommodate in a conflict style of resolution, the relationship is important than winning. And the issue is that it's very important to the other person, but it's not important to you. Okay? And we all have issuance or circumstances where we accommodate something or someone. But again, we look at it that it's important to the other person, but may not be as important to me. Maybe the team wants to go to lunch to a specific restaurant. Okay, I may not like Mexican food, but it's important that some members have Mexican food rather than me. So it's not important, and I could accommodate that, right? Okay. And look at again. Again, this is not an important immediate use where a decision needs to be made right now. Avoidance. I know in my personal life sometimes I try to avoid rather than just deal with the situation. And when you avoid, the issue is, you don't want to deal with something that's trivial. The conflict will resolve itself on its own. And sometimes that's good, sometimes not so bad. But I've learned that this is not the most appropriate style to resolve that conflict, and to use something else. And if this has happened to you, maybe later on as we get to some target way of resolving conflict, you'll see that maybe this is not the best method to avoid. It's not that, bury your head in the sand and hope it'll go away. It's not going to go away. Sometimes it just gets worse. Okay, so let's create an effective atmosphere where we can resolve this conflict. And we always want to come from a positive viewpoint versus a negative. So we begin by turning around that negative energy into a positive. Example, it's like I always say to someone, or like my son, for example, when he says, I can't do that, I was like, well, what if you try versus can't? And if just by changing the language that we use, sometimes what we realize that there is no conflict. The conflict was all surrounded by the language. So if we create a positive atmosphere, positive language, we see that conflict is really sometimes dissipate and we don't have that situation. As we talked about in the beginning, when we neutralize the emotions and take that out of the process, what you see happen to the conflict or in a conflict situation is that the negative feelings that we have, I'm sorry, these feelings are normal, but they don't consume us in the conflict resolution. And when we acknowledge those feelings and their root causes, again, the conflict dissipate. And that's just being in total integrity with ourselves and not worry about the other person. You identify how you might resolve your feelings. And one of the best methods that I use personally to resolve my feeling when conflict arises in my life is to write down those feelings that I'm having, the pros and the cons. And I realized that I really want more positive interactions or feelings than the ones that I write on the negative side of it. And I look at it and it says, wow, there is no conflict. And it really has dissipated the amount of conflict in my life just by doing that, writing the pros and the cons, and then to acknowledge the feelings that I have that surround that conflict. We set ground rules. And let me just ask on the panel, does anyone set ground rules when they are in a conflict situation? Okay. So when you set the ground rules, you provide a framework to resolve the conflict in a positive way. It should be set at the beginning of the resolution process and have brief but very detailed statements. So here's an example of what the ground rules should look like. They're developed and agreed upon by both parties. They're positive when possible. They are fair to both parties. They're enforceable, adjustable, and they're written as well as posted. Does that sound good to each of us? Here's some examples of ground rules that you might use. We will listen to each other's statement fully before responding. You know, sometimes we listen to answer rather than listen to hear what the individual is saying to us. And that usually in itself is a way of initiating conflict when we listen to answer rather than listen to hear. We work together to achieve mutually acceptable solution. And we will respect each other's individual and therefore not engage in personal insults and attack. And that's just a prime response from anyone with respect to conflict, is that we tend to take it personally and want to defend. But if we let it go and take out the emotions out of it, we see that we don't really need to defend, because sometimes the conflict, it really is that the other individual just wants to be heard. Okay. So when possible, is try to find a mutually environment or place where it's not where the conflict arose, and that you could sit with the other person and have a discussion. You know, maybe a coffee shop or the conference room or some other place other than where the immediate thing happened. Make sure there's time allowed for the conflict. You don't want to rush through it, because that's when you're rushing through it and you have to get back to work in 10 minutes and it's like, okay, I have to resolve it now. I have to resolve it now. It may, you're just inherently developing more conflict than would be necessary then to resolve it. If you're mediating a conflict resolution meeting, be conscious of the needs of both parties when scheduling the meeting and follow the tips that we talked about before. Mutual understanding, win-win situations, and mutual gain is our preferred outcome for any conflict. And we will explore here how to create mutual understanding that can lay the groundwork for a win-win situation. How does that sound? Okay. When I enter into any conflict or trying to resolve any conflict situation with another party, I always ask this question from both parties: what do you specifically want? And when you turn that to yourself, it's like, what do you want? Because many times when we are entering a conflict, we're not sure about the resolution. And if we know what we want going into the process, it makes that conversation or a conflict situation much easier to resolve. So when you can identify what you personally want from that and state it in a positive way, how easy does that situation become for you to resolve? I want a fair and share of new customers, for example. I want better working relationship with my manager. I want to change my schedule. So that's important, knowing that when you go into the situation. Now look at, on the flip side of it, what do they want? What does my opponent need, want, or most important or least important to them? And always have a couple of items that you could give that doesn't really mean anything to you. Example, if you wanted to change your work schedule, maybe for you may not want to come in at, say, 10 o'clock, but it would be okay to come in at 11 or 12. So it's okay if they said, okay, how about coming in at 11? Would that work? Sure, that's fine. So if you give away something that's not really important to you, it helps in the situation and make the other person feel like they've won a point when it really didn't or wasn't important to you. So here's a chart that you could use. And by the way, Sydney will have all these PowerPoints available to you after the workshop. And if you want, you could use them as you please. So know that you can have them anytime just for attending. Isn't that great? Okay. So here's a little chart between Joe and George in what their wants are and their needs are. And I'm not going to go through it, but this is something that you can use yourself in your conflict resolution that you may have about with another person or any situation that you may have that may come up or arise. Now let's focus on individual and shared needs, because so far we've talked about laying the foundation for common ground, or one key in building blocks for a win-win situation. Now we're going to look at some techniques for building common ground and how to use common grounds to create a partnership. So to find common ground, you should continue to try to find a common ground throughout the entire conflict resolution process. It will help you understand the adversary position and better position you to help create that win-win situation. These are goodwill gestures and will help make the shift from being two people in a conflict to two people where they work to resolve the problem. So these are some things that we can do to build positive energy and goodwill. Always have a good attitude. Frame things positively. Create actionable items and keep your emotions out of the statements. Take a break when you need it. And if you say, I see where you're coming from, and make sure you mean that. And here's something that I do when conflict resolutions, I'm mediating with someone. I grab them by the hand and I say, let's try this for an example. So if you're there, and I'm gonna do it too, I stand up and I say, let's shake hands for a moment, because I could see behind my adversary and my adversary can't see behind me. And if I turn around and turn them around, now I see their point of view and they see my point of view. It's a very simple exercise. However, it changes the whole concept of conflict in that, oh my goodness, I didn't realize how you were looking at that particular point of view versus how I had looked at it before. And usually that creates such an energetic, positive breakthrough for the individual, that all the fight and anger just simply dissipate in that moment when I shake hands and said, let's just switch for a moment and I take your side and you take my side. That is one of the most effective way of using positive energy and goodwill in a conflict resolution that I've ever used. So again, here's another chart that we're all probably familiar with. In 1965, Tuckman developed this 4-stage model for group team building, and it's called forming, storming, norming, and performing. And when you look at this is what a group goes through when they are from the beginning stage of developing a team environment through the ending stage where they are just performing at all cylinders and everything is just working ideal. Have you had that in your work life situation? Great. We're moving right along with this. And now we're looking at the root cause, because when we get to the core of where that conflict arose, it's easy to resolve it and to be in integrity with ourselves. So let's learn about how to delve below the current conflict to the root cause. Once the groundwork has been laid, it is important to look at the root cause of the conflict. One way to do this is through simple verbal investigation that involves continuously asking why, to get to the root cause of the problem. So paying attention to the wording of the root cause is important. Watch out for vague words and to keep emotions out of the problems. Have I stressed the word emotions enough throughout this process? Because as you see, in all conflict, the root cause of any conflict comes from our personal emotions, what we are feeling. And once we identify with that, what emotions we're feeling, that we're angry, we're feeling upset, we're feeling despondent, whatever those emotions are, once we identify them and acknowledge them, then we can effectively handle the conflict and resolve it in a positive, energetic way with the other person, where it becomes a win-win for everyone. So here's the importance of forgiveness. And I have to confess, so can I take a moment to tell you a story? I could never understand, or I never did previously understood, when I saw a tragic incident on television and the individual would say, I forgive them. And it's like, seriously, you forgave them after they caused that much hurt and anger? Until it happened to me. And what I learned was this, that the forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It was about me moving on and creating happiness in my life. And as long as I held that anger inside, I was never going to grow. And when I let that go and forgave them, then I could grow, or other words, take giant steps or leap into And that was one of the most effective way that I've come to resolve conflict and frustration. So it doesn't mean that you forget what happened, but it does mean that you erase the emotion that caused it. And when you look at that and you accept those things that happen, working through it made you feel better, right? That you accept the consequences that was there, and letting those emotion and action exist in the past. So allow you to move forward freely without that 99,900-pound gorilla on your shoulder. And that's the power of forgiveness in conflict. You let that go and understand it's not about them, but it's about you letting go. Identify the benefits of that conflict. So you are the person that are in conflict may arrive at a point where you wonder, is it really worth it? What could happen if the conflict is not resolved? And use this question. What relationship will deteriorate or break up? If this is a workplace conflict, what is the financial cost to the company? Or better yet, what is the financial cost to you? What will be the emotional cost to the participant and to others? And who else will be effective? And these are really powerful questions that we should think about as we enter into or feel conflict about a situation. And because there's always a cost. And when you let those costs go internally or emotionally, I can't express the return on that investment of letting that go enough. So those are some of the benefits. But look at these questions. And like I said, Sydney will have this PowerPoint, but get this point. This is like one of the most important slides that will be in this presentation for you, is understanding the benefits. Because when you come from a benefit side of it, you see the positive growth of it versus the negative. Does that sound good? Okay. So now let's look at options, because we always want to have options to handle whether it's conflict or the time of all the parties or generating options for a resolution. So it's about quantity, not quality. And you may want as many options to choose from as possible. Because how do you feel if you're engaged in something and you don't have any options? You feel stuck, cornered. And, look at the quote that I have here from Henry David Thoreau. It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. So generate options, don't evaluate them. So when you generate ideas for resolving symptoms of a conflict, then you move on to the root cause and expand your list of ideas. Now let's create some mutual gain options and multiple option solution. So once you have a good list, look over the list and perform some basic evaluation. Cross off those things that are not absolute no-goes for either parties. Going to a Chinese restaurant, deleted, gone. Going to McDonald's, deleted, gone. Highlight the options that provide gains for both parties. Maybe Mexican food might be good. maybe a good taco, something on that list may be appealing to both you and the other party. Look for options that can be combined for an optimal solution. And make the options more detailed where appropriate, and continue brainstorming and generating ideas. And here's a simple suggestion. The more questions you ask of yourself and of your opponent or the other party, the clearer it becomes. Like, my unique contribution is creating breakthroughs with questions. I ask a gazillion questions, but I notice every question I ask, my opponent becomes more clear and more resolute in his or her clarity about resolving the conflict in a positive way. Ask questions. Digging deeper into the options. Once the list has been narrowed down, dig deeper. And again, like I said, ask questions, because the effort of each option on a scale of 10. So what's important? 1 meaning it's not important, 10 meaning it's most important to you. Rate them and see where you are. Your estimation of the likelihood of success, other options that can be used to complement it, and each party's preference. One of the questions I like to ask is, especially in conflict, is which feels better? Which option feels better? Does option A feel better, or does option B feel better? And then I go further. If you could have option A, but never can you have option B, which one feels better? And at that point, they really come back to the core of what was most important, that root cause. Because I want a schedule that helps me to have work-life balance. That's important to me. Working 10 o'clock on Monday through Thursday for 12 hours a day, okay, if it creates that work-life balance, that's important to me. Maybe it's not important to others, but when I ask the question, which is more important and which feels better, they get it. How about you build a solution? Once you lay those out, time can move on to choose a solution and lay the groundwork. Let's explore the criteria of how to use to create a short list of options so you can move on to a solution. And I haven't seen any questions yet. So does that mean either I'm well understood or everyone has gotten it? Yes? Okay. So I keep moving on. Okay. So here's another chart that you can use for your solutions option to evaluate them. So look at this chart for a moment, and I intentionally left it blank. So what's the criteria? What are your wants and your needs? Shared with the opponent, and what you want to compromise on. So try not to think of the different options as you create the criteria. Focus instead on the wants and the needs of both parties. Wants are not as important as your needs. So you always want to put the priority in what your needs are. And again, remember I said if I drew the heart, what I want in the middle of the heart is the word and. I never want the R because I don't want to lose an option or feel like I've lost an option. So when I have the and in there, I'm satisfied with the outcome on the left and I'm satisfied with the outcome on the right. And you create a short list. So the criteria have been stated. You bring out the list of solutions. You eliminate anything that do not match the must-have that you want or your partner is identified. And at the end of the process, you should have a small, manageable list of potential solutions. Does that sound like a workable plan for you? So in choosing the final solution, remember, you can often combine multiple options for even greater success. So here's a checklist that you can use to evaluate your chosen option. Is it a win-win solution for both parties? Are all the needs provided for? Are all the criteria met? And not listed on here, are you in integrity with yourself in that you were honest with what your wants were and your needs, and that you acknowledge them throughout the process and the discussion, and you didn't give away something that was really important to you? So if you remember those, then the solution that you've created will allow you to build a plan that will let you put the solution into action. And the plan should vary with the complexity of the situation. It's important that each party take responsibility to implement a solution, even if it is determined that one party is at fault. So the action plan should also include a list of things to do if the conflict is not resolved after implementing a solution. And if it's not resolved after implementing the solution, what do? You go back and you restart the process again to see what was missed. Because if it didn't acknowledge and resolve the situation after you implemented, that meant one party was not in integrity with him or herself during the conflict resolution process, and they gave away things that were important to them. So you always have to remember, you need to keep those things that are important to you and acknowledge that. The short version of the process, in this part, we're going to look through an abridged version of the process that can be used quickly and easily to successfully resolve conflicts. Okay. So in phase one, we want to, again, create an effective atmosphere, usually a mutually place that's different from where the conflict arose. Take a moment, count to 10, and deal with your emotions. Because if you don't deal with your emotions prior to entering the conflict resolution process, you're not going to resolve the conflict because you're so heavily involved with your emotion rather than a solution. Create a mutual understanding and quickly evaluate your wants and needs and those of the other party, and try to identify the real issue. And in phase three, you're going to focus on individual and shared goals and identify common ground. Now let's look through phases 4 and 5. Think about a current conflict that you have. So take a second to think about a conflict that's occurring right now in your life. Is it really the root cause or just a symptom of a larger problem? Because most often than not, it's just a symptom, it's not the root cause. So how could the problem be resolved? You know, get out your smartphone or pen and paper if you have it, and make a short list of possible solutions. And I said on in the phone or paper, it's more tangible and recognizable if we write it down and put it on paper or put it on something that where we can see it. Because if we keep it in our heads, the mind will don't see any gaps or connection per se, but we recognize the gaps when we put it on paper. So that's why I'm telling you to write it down, whether it's on your tablet, your iPhone, your Galaxy, or whatever. Write it down rather than keep it in your head. Create an action plan. Once you have some ideas of how to resolve the conflict, do a quick evaluation of that. What do you want and need out of that situation? What might the other party want or need? And sketch out the solution. And always, always have a backup plan just in case that one doesn't work. Again, that goes back to having options. When we don't have options, we feel very frustrated. But if we have options to choose between A, B, and C, then we feel, okay, this one doesn't work. I could go route B and be okay with that. Have you ever been stuck in traffic and there's a detour and you can't move? The conflict of the situation immediately dissipate once you're able to turn and enter and go another route, correct? Exactly. Always have options. So if we look at an individual process, a new person has joined the team, right? And this always happens because someone new always comes onto the team. They're very quiet, and they keep to themselves and is having a hard time getting to know or like her. Some of the tools we've discussed today to build common ground with and improve the teamwork. I am a very gregarious person, so it doesn't matter if somebody new comes on the team. I'm going to jump in there and start talking to them and having conversation. But if they're kind of aloof and don't want to talk back, I kind of hold back a little bit, and then I go back in the next day and try again to bring them out, because it's very uncomfortable joining a team and not knowing anyone. But as soon as they feel comfortable, they open up and they become a part of the team. But sometimes it's a little bit hard. How about attending that weekly meeting that's going on, and this one has gotten out of hand? They talk over each other, they argue constantly, and some leave the room, and you feel that the time you spent at that meeting has absolutely been a waste. That is an inherent conflict that can be arose, and you could figure out by using the chart is like, what do you want? What is the purpose of that meeting, that you allow yourself to not get frustrated or angry about it. So look at these individual things that you can do in your work life that alleviates some of the conflicts you may have or feel, or that surround some of the situations. So we're going to wrap up, but before I wrap up, I want to give you another tool that you can use in terms of resolving conflict that I use a lot, and which has helped me to keep calm in situation. And it's called Nature's Guidance System, and it's not on here, but if you want to take some notes on it, the first thing I do when conflict arises is to notice that I'm in conflict. And then the second thing I want to do is to breathe. You know, take deep breaths. So if you want to practice with me for a second, take deep breaths, just breathe and let it out. So breathe to calm myself down, to look at it. Then I want to ask myself to be open. You know, look at the possibilities. And after I ask myself to be open, I want to go into and recognize the feeling. Whatever positive, negative, whatever feelings I'm having, I want to recognize them. And this goes back to the root cause of the situation, of the conflict. Recognize that feeling that you have. And then feel that feeling. Feel it. And then there's a 4-part tools that I have, which are mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. Sometimes for me, when I have conflict and I can't resolve it in a moment, I like to run. Some people may like meditation. Others may like yoga. Some like to read or go to the movies. So take that moment to recognize and use a tool that's effective for you to get to a state where you can separate the emotions. And then the last step in this process is to communicate. And that's the key for conflict resolution, is communicate your feelings. Because if you can communicate your feelings, you can recognize and see the other person's point of view, and they can recognize and see your point of view, where it creates a win-win situation. And that's the methodology I use to mediate conflict resolution, to alleviate conflict resolution personally, at work, or in my personal life, or any situation. I use those particular tools: nature's guidance system and being integrated with myself. So, that's what I do when in terms of conflict. And those are some tools that I recommend to you that you can use. And, pretty much this is it. So here's nature's guidance system that we talked about. And you can, again, use that. If you want to know more about that, ask Sydney and she'll get in touch with me and I will let you know with respect to that. So, questions that you may have during this process. All right, can everyone hear me?
Sorry, Heather, I think we lost you for a second there. I couldn't hear you. I don't know about anyone else. If you just want to put in the questions box if you can hear Heather or not.
Okay. No questions? Uh, Wait, I saw one comment that it was going a little bit too, I was going a little bit too fast. Uh, did it all get together, connect up for you?
Yep, if anyone's got any questions, just pop them in the question box. We still got like 4 or 5 minutes. So if there are any questions you want answered, then be sure to pop them in there. Doesn't look like anyone's got any questions. Yeah, like Heather said, I'll have all the PowerPoint, the presentation. So if anyone wishes to have it, I will send that out along with the recording of this webinar. Tomorrow could be Monday. So yeah, as I said, this webinar is being recorded, and a link will be sent out to those of you that wish to see it again. If there are no questions, and Heather, if you want to say anything else before we finish.
I thank you for coming. Like I said, I think the biggest tool or the most important tool for conflict is just recognizing your personal emotions in it. And I have to say, I get tied up in my emotions too, but when I do get tied up in that emotion, I go back and I use that nature's guidance system as a tool to help me to get grounded and rooted. And when I use that, I see or I feel the conflict dissipate or the intensity of it lessen dramatically. And if it works for you, great. But it's really an effective tool that you can use. And I didn't go much into the 4 different elements of tools that you could use, but like I said, there's physical tools, there's mental tools, there's emotional tool, there's any type of tools that you want that allows you to, you know, bring back calm to you, that allows you to separate the emotions, because that's what really causes conflict, is the emotions, that we're so emotional and tied into it. And if we could separate that out a little bit and be on like a third party looking at it, we really do get to resolve the conflict effectively.
That's some great advice. Thank you, Heather. If anyone's got any questions, don't hesitate to contact us at infos@webinarsteam.com. I would really like to hear some of your suggestions for future webinars we could hold. So yeah, thank you, Heather, and we'll see you next week.
All right, thank you. Have a great one.